heard the story of the woman who spent the first day after her divorce sadly packing her belongings into boxes, crates, suitcases. And on the second day she had the movers come and collect all her things. On the third day she sat down on the floor in the dining room by candlelight, put on some soft background music and feasted on a kilo of prawns, a jar of caviar and a bottle of Chardonnay. When she'd finished, she went into each and every room and deposited a few half-eaten prawns and caviar into the hollow of the curtain rods. She replaced the end caps on the curtain rods, cleaned up in the kitchen and left. When the ex-husband returned with his new girlfriend, all was bliss for the first few days. Then slowly, the house began to smell. They tried everything. Cleaning, mopping, airing the place out. Vents were checked for dead rodents. The carpets were steam cleaned. Air fresheners hung everywhere. Exterminators were brought in, set off gas canisters, and during which time they had to move out even for a few days, and they had to pay to replace the expensive wool carpets. Nothing worked. People stopped coming over to visit. Repairmen refused to work in the house. The maid quit. Finally, they couldn't take the stench any longer and they decided to move. A month later, even though they'd cut the price in half, they couldn't find a buyer for their stinky house. Word got out, and eventually the local real estate agents refused to return their calls. Finally, they had to borrow a huge sum of money from the bank to purchase a new place. The ex-wife called the man and asked how things were going. He told her that they were selling the house, but didn't tell her the real reason. She listened politely, said she missed her old home terribly, and would be willing to reduce her divorce settlement in exchange for getting the house back. Thinking that his wife had no idea about the smell, he agreed on a price that was about 1/10 of what the house had been worth, but only if she would sign the papers that very day. She agreed. And within the hour, his lawyers delivered the paperwork for her to sign. A week later, the man and his girlfriend stood smiling as they watched the moving company pack everything and take it to their new home, including the curtain rods. I am terribly worried about you lot, that you would enjoy that story quite so much. Why is it that we enjoy a story like that so much? Perhaps because we too have been wronged somewhere along the way, and we like to hear a good getting even story. Yes? Enjoyment, however, points to an underlying reality. The reality that perhaps in reality, we really are a vengeful lot. We don't want to admit it perhaps, but we prefer to see people get even rather than to forgive. Would that be true? And when Jesus invites us to pray, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, we fully understand the sentiment of the man who always pretended to forget the words of the Lord's Prayer because he didn't want to forgive his business partner for swindling him out of his business. So how should we approach this very awkward gospel reading from today, which tells us to keep forgiving over and over? Take a little poll here. Everyone here who wants to do the right thing, please put up your hand. Very good. Everyone who wants to do what Jesus asks of you, what God wants, put up your hand. You shouldn't have to think about that too long, Jack. Put your hand up. That's fantastic. Now just look around, all those hands in the air. You all here want to do the right thing. Now, everyone, however, who's ever felt like asking the same question that Peter asked, you put up your hand. How many times do I have to forgive, Lord? Yes. How often do I have to give them a second chance and a third chance and so on? We really are a bit like Peter, aren't we? Whether we're male or female, young or old, we have our limits, especially when it comes to pain, especially when it comes to setting ourselves up to get hurt again and again by the same person. But we want to do the right thing, even if it costs us. And Peter, good old Peter, he really does try, just like we try. In his response to Jesus' question, Peter was being generous. The rabbis said that the standard for forgiveness was 3 times. But Peter knew, probably instinctively, that Jesus would want more than that. How much more? Well, he goes for 7. 7 sounded like a good guess. It was a holy number for the Jews. 7 sounded good, and Peter went with 7 times. 7 times, Lord. In other words, will I fulfill the requirement if I forgive my Christian brother or sister 7 times? Then Peter stood back, waiting for a pat on the back. He thought that Jesus would say, 7 times would be great, Peter. Forgive your brother or sister 7 times. Peter wanted to hear Jesus say, "You've got it right, Peter." His proposal to forgive 7 times was generous, but not generous enough. And Jesus responded, not 7 times, but 77 times. And in the King James Version of the Bible, of course, it says 70 times 7, which would be, I will get to that later, because that's too hard for my brain. In fact, doesn't Jesus just drive you crazy sometimes with these things? It's a bit much, this answer. I mean, how's a person supposed to keep track? Anybody got a calculator? 7 times 7, 49, add 0. 490. Thank you, Doreen. Yes, the mathematicians can do it like that. 490. But it's about impossible to keep track of. You'd have to have a book or something, a ledger, a diary, just to manage it. And it would have to be pretty large, because there's a lot of people who hurt us every day. And it would have to be pretty portable at the same time, because after all, people will ask us forgiveness in the strangest of places and at the strangest of times. I've had people ask me for a second chance in some very unusual and very ordinary places. Maybe someone could develop a phone app. That would be good. You're already thinking that, Ross, aren't you? Onto it. Or all you Apple smartwatch people, a smartwatch that beeped at you to tell you, that's so-and-so, you need to forgive them. You have now reached X number of forgiveness with that person. An app, that'd be good. But then you'd also need to keep track of all those times you forgive a person without them asking to be forgiven. And 490 is still a lot of times. Keeping score in matters of forgiveness is not only ridiculous, it's harmful. Harmful not just to a person that we're resentful and angry at, but harmful to ourselves. The fact is that in matters of forgiveness, the person who keeps score is almost always the biggest loser. And it doesn't really matter, does it? 77 times or 490 times, we can't really keep track of either one, can we? When Jesus told Peter that he had to forgive 77 times, it was just a backhanded way of telling him to get rid of his list, to get rid of the spreadsheet, to get rid of his calculator, to stop trying to keep trap. Now, I told a story the other day at the Bible study group, and I think I'll share it again. It's a story against myself, so I'm safe in. I'm the only one who's going to look dopey here. But the story goes that back in my first parish, we did a lot of weddings. Let me also say, there is apparently no sermon in the world that can compete with a little magpie coming in to visit us during the service. So I appreciate that. And St. Francis in me said, "Welcome, Brother Bird. Please listen attentively to what I'm saying, because you might learn something." That's right. Fluff your feathers at me later. So in my first parish, we did a lot of weddings, something like 150 weddings a year. There were 4 ministers in this parish in the days when we used to have several churches in a parish. 150 weddings, that's nearly three a weekend. It was a busy church for weddings. And we all took turns, sort of first one Saturday or one weekend a month, we would be rostered on for doing the weddings for that day. And so you did get a bit blasé about it. I did, I know, I confess. And I would sort of do wedding sermon A, readings A, B, C, you just sort of mix and match and keep it interesting. But it was a different crowd of each wedding, so no one would ever hear you twice, at least you hope. So on this particular occasion, I'd done all the preparation with the couple, got to know them quite well, and the story was that the fellow was getting married, again, it was his second marriage, because his wife had run off with his brother. And the only problem with that was that his parents had sided with his brother and were supportive of this new relationship, his wife with his brother. And he was definitely out in the cold, and so even though they were all invited to the wedding, it was all going to be rather tense sort of affair, you can imagine. So I'm into this wedding and doing it on the actual day, and I've chosen wedding readings B, that 1 Corinthians 13, that gets a bit done, so I won't do that. I'll use the reading from 1 John, and so I start in with the reading. If anybody says they love God but hates their brother, they're a liar. And so it goes on. I tell you, you look it up, there is no way out of this reading. You just have to keep going. So I'm reading, and it must say about 3 times, you've got to love the brother that you do see if you want to love God. And it goes on and on in that vein. And I'm thinking, please stop this reading. To an end. Sometime, please stop. Ground, open up, do anything. It was one of those awkward kind of moments. However, the following day, after the wedding, knock at the door, and this guy and his new wife arrive with a bottle of champers from the wedding reception to give to me to thank me for the wedding. That in itself was rather unusual. But they thanked me for the wedding, and I started before they could even open their mouths. I said, "Look, I'm so sorry for choosing that reading. It was a bit of a mistake. I wasn't thinking, didn't know what I was doing. Sorry about that." And they said, "No, it was great." Led to a lot of conversation afterwards, and the family had a moment of reconciliation because of it. I thought he was coming to clock me one, but it wasn't like that. I got a bottle of champers out of it, and the story came out okay. A good moment of reconciliation. Keeping score is not necessarily a good thing. If you keep a ledger, if you can never get to a moment of reconciliation, if your scorekeeping is so severe, you'll only end up in the red. That's not completely true, because I did bring along some bits of paper which have scores on them. This is scores from the family Scrabble games, where I find keeping score is quite good. Score says Andrew, 307, Liliani, 134, Catalina, 122. Over the page, Andrew, 219, Liliani, 140, Catalina, 119, and so on. Keeping score can be a good thing, unless I play Scrabble with Jim. and then the scores won't come out in my favour. So that's not good. Keeping score can be good. Keeping score usually is bad, and keeping score when it comes to matters of forgiveness is not a good idea. I think Jesus suggests a different way of keeping score. He suggests in the story that if you remember how much mercy God has shown you, if you allow the incredible wonder of God's grace and God's forgiveness to fill your mind and your heart, if you recognise the incredible mercy God has poured out on you, then you, in turn, will be able to forgive others as often as needed. And it'll be a forgiveness that comes from your heart. I heard of a woman who disliked a singularly obnoxious neighbour and was put in a bad mood every morning when she was standing at her sink fixing the breakfast. And she'd watch him driving off to work. Finally, she watched him one morning, and as the familiar feeling of resentment began to rise, she whispered to herself, "Here's a person for whom Christ Jesus died." And just that little bit of theological insight applied to her neighbour was the antidote to her resentment. The point is, God doesn't keep track with us, and neither should we keep track with others. Keeping track is not gospel, and it's not good for us. The gospel is that we can come to God over and over again, and that we can have a fresh start each day. The past is put behind us and forgotten completely. The gospel is that when we remember the mercy of God towards us, it's easier to show mercy, just as God showed mercy towards us. And the story Jesus tells, that king and his servants, is a cracking story where Jesus just takes it to the limit. The number itself, 77 times, or 490, or whatever the number is just an outrageous number about how many times to forgive. But so is the story. A man with 10,000 talents. First of all, a talent was the largest unit of money. And 10,000 was the biggest number there was in Greek. So it's like saying squillions of dollars. In fact, the entire budget for the province of Judea was 600 talents a year. Got it? 10,000 talents. We're talking squillions. Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos amounts. We're talking billions of dollars of the debt that is forgiven. That's the point of Jesus' story. And a denarius was the wage for one day for a worker. So if you owe someone 100, that's still a big amount of money, but probably achievable. Certainly when you're talking, well, you get the picture. The whole story is huge to remind us of God's forgiveness of us. But I also need to add one word of caution at the end. A point of clarification. Forgiveness isn't putting up with things, with abuse, forever. I often find myself talking to someone who can't forgive. And at that moment I dig into my memory banks and point out that the Greek word to forgive, aphiemai, means simply to open your hand and drop what it's clutching. To let go. And sometimes letting go of the situations and the things which cause us constant hurt is also a way of moving forward and forgiving. And I think that fits theologically with the word forgive, to let go of the things that hurt. The story is one of overwhelming forgiveness, as we are reminded that God forgives us and we are to forgive others. We are forgiven and forgiving people. God is forgiveness. Dare to forgive, and God will be with you. God is forgiveness. Love, and do not